Joining me now, CNN national reporter and race and inequality reporter Tanzina Vega and Yodit Tewolde, a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor. Ladies, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Good morning.
Good morning. Tanzina, I wanted to start with you because you had said that, and I want to read this right, these moments that we've been seeing have been built on dog whistles. What do you mean by that?
So dogwhistle politics is something that isn't new. These are the sort of coded languages, coded phrases and language that are used. We heard a lot of this during the Donald Trump's campaign, right? But we've seen this used in the Southern strategy. We've seen it used during the Nixon campaign. These are words sort of like inner city. So what does that represent? You know, that usually represents scary brown people and black people who are living in crime-ridden communities, right? And lawlessness, this idea of law and order, right? So these are the sort of ideas that have started to creep into this administration in particular. And so those are coded phrases meant to sort of invoke this idea that brown people and black people are largely scary and lawless. And so that's the coded language. But we're also seeing lots of uncoded language, right? When the campaign started, this campaign started around the idea of Mexican immigrants or some Mexican immigrants as criminals. We've talked about banning Muslims. There's been all of this language around the fear and intimidation that brown and black Americans and immigrants could represent. So that's very important to pay attention to the language. This didn't just happen yesterday.
Yeah, very good point. And because of that, we've heard hate speech for a long time, Yodit, but help us understand from a legal perspective, when does hate speech cross the line into a hate crime?
So essentially, the First Amendment, we all know, gives us freedom of speech and expression. And that would also include views that are racist, offensive, unpopular. And so there's this misconception that speech that's hateful isn't protected under the First Amendment, and that's not true. It actually is. But the First Amendment isn't absolute. Free speech isn't absolute. There are limitations of the First Amendment's guarantee to free speech and expression. And that means that when speech then goes over and crosses over into threats or incitement of rioting, criminal behavior, that is when that speech is unprotected. And so, as much as we don't like what this message is at these rallies with these white nationalists and these neo-Nazi groups, we have to respect the right that gives them the capabilities to go out and spread those messages. And to be quite honest, as much as I hate what they're saying, I've got to respect the right of them to say it. And I think it's best to say these things in an open forum rather than censoring them, because to be quite honest, this might be the confrontational side to me, but I would rather confront these thoughts and these beliefs out in the open. And there is a lot of people, and I'm kind of confused, that are sort of astonished as to what is going on when we kind of know minorities and people of color have known that this has been going on for quite some time. So to have people actually see these people in the streets rallying and saying these disgusting and bigoted things is really an eye-opener, and I think it's a good thing.
I agree with that. I think white America, this was a wake-up call for a lot of white Americans who had, thought that this was something that was left in the past, who didn't assume that we were still, dealing with these types of issues or this level of hatred. And it's great that this is out in the open. I think we're having a really intense conversation around whose culture, whose history the United States is going to represent. But this isn't something that's new, as our other guests mentioned. And I think we really need to pay attention to why it took so long for particularly white Americans, to really realize that this was a problem.
No doubt about it. Let me ask you, Tanzina, if you have any sense, what is the end game for these neo-Nazis?
I mean, we're looking at what's their philosophy, right? The basic philosophy in this and a lot of these hate groups is superiority of the white race, is how, we have to look at this. And and if you have a superior race, you have an inferior race. So a lot of them, there's been a lot of talk of rebranding of things like the KKK and the alt-right or the alt-light. At the end of the day, a lot of these groups have the same goal in mind, which is a separate ethno-state, as they refer to it, of white Americans with European blood blood and the purity of whiteness. That, I think, is ultimately the end goal. How they're going to execute that, how they're going to carry that out, we're starting to see now. I think it remains to be seen how much violence is going to be used throughout and to get these messages across. And so, that's essentially what the end game is. And we heard a lot of that, once again, going back to the issue of dog whistle politics throughout the campaign, of making our country great again, of taking this country back, right? Who are we taking the country back from? I mean, we're looking at, when we look at the demographics, when we look at the fact that we just had our first black president the last, 8 years. And so taking the country back from whom? From the growth of black and brown Americans and the increasing minority population. We really have to pay attention to that. Because if that's the case, we're in for a pretty difficult next couple of years.
No doubt about it. And Yodit, real quickly, there was an image last week that Victor and I saw where there was a line of these white supremacists holding guns about at this time, about an hour and a half before the rally was supposed to start. They have every right to hold those guns. It is their Second Amendment right. Nobody's trying to take that away from them. Is there ever a point, however, that holding a gun coupled with the things that they say becomes criminal in some way? It becomes threatening.
It could. When you have words that people are saying and they're indicating that they can actually or are willing to act on those words, that then becomes a threat. So on top of that, when you have those words that are threatening and then coupled with the fact that you have a gun and are willing to, or giving the impression that you're willing to use the gun, that can also be perceived as a threat. And so hopefully that won't be the case. I'm not sure with Massachusetts if they're an open carry, if that's going to be the case at all. But yes, it could be seen as a threat, and it could be criminal if it goes down that path and results in a criminal conduct. So yeah, it could be, absolutely.
Okay.
I also want to add a note about the guns and being out. I mean, if we had seen Native Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans showing up to rallies fully armed and in full gear, I imagine the response would have been quite different, both from law enforcement and from the media. Yeah. And so I don't think that we can sit here and say, this is just, these are people that have the right to do that, and that's totally, up to them. And again, each state has their own open carry laws and what have you. But let's imagine for a minute that this was another group of people of color, other organizations, fully armed to the nines, what that would have looked like and what the response would have been.
You're right. What it would have looked like is very different. But legally, those people would have had the absolute right to carry as well. And just to answer a question, so everybody has some clarity here, we're looking at some pictures from Boston. No weapons are allowed, and that has been something that has been mandated by officials there in Boston. No weapons allowed at this rally in particular. Yodit, Tanzina, we so appreciate the conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christy.